Good evening, everyone. To all the new audience members who have joined us today for this session, I'm Isha, Platforms Officer at AVPN, your MC for this session, and I'm very delighted to have you join us today. Over the next 30 minutes, our speakers from Save the Children and UNHCR will discuss how their models of humanitarian response address the increasing need to build climate resilience among the communities. Before we begin, I would like to inform our new audience members that to download any session resources, please click on the download icon in the agenda page beside the session title. To continue chatting with the speakers and fellow delegates in the session, please make full use of the messaging function or the event feed in the platform. Finally, please note that this session will be recorded and you will be able to access the recordings for the 3 weeks after the festival. I now call upon David Fallman, Corporate Partnerships Manager, Save the Children, to begin the session. Over to you, David.
Thanks so much, Isha, and good evening, everyone. We're really grateful that you've chosen to be part of the session today. Before we proceed any further, I'd like to pay my respects and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today, as we're dispersed across the South Asian region and around the world. For me personally, I'm just outside of Melbourne in Australia, so I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land here, the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nations. I'd also like to pay my respects to all elders past, present and emerging. Now, I did just mention that I'm here in Australia. And so for me, that means that it's almost midnight here. But despite the time zone, I promise I won't fall asleep. And the reason why is because we've got a really interesting and relevant session for you today. Our session is going to focus on greening humanitarian responses. And, so often when we think about responses to climate change, we think of high-level mitigation strategies and commitment to net zero emissions. Look, rather than focusing on that high-level type of response, today we really want to consider changing the very nature of support to the most vulnerable communities in this part of the world. And that's really centered around ideas of climate resilience and adaptation. So to do that, we're going to go on a bit of a journey together today. We're going to commence and look at some of the perspectives and the challenges, really identifying what is the climate change problem facing the most vulnerable communities in this part of the world. We'll then look at some approaches and responses, and specifically we'll look at what UNHCR and Save the Children are doing to push the bounds of innovation in climate resilience and adaptation for these sorts of communities that we're talking about. We'll then have a look at the impacts and the outcomes, what will be the results of these types of initiatives and why are they different to other responses that we've seen in the past. And then we'll really close out with a bit of a consideration for all of us as to how we can engage. So let me introduce our very talented and well-credentialed and very interesting speakers for today. Firstly, we have Irene Sun, who is the Head of Innovation Finance at UNHCR, the UN's refugee agency. And there, Irene is really helping UNHCR design and develop innovative financing mechanisms beyond the agency's traditional grant-based funding approach. And this approach is really about benefiting refugees, host communities, and even supporting UNHCR's own finances. Our second speaker is Paul Mitchell, and Paul works for Save the Children Australia as Principal Climate Change Advisor, where he provides technical expertise for Save the Children's engagement in climate change programming and the Green Climate Fund around the world. Irene and Paul, great to have you both as our guest speakers today. How are you both doing, and what part of the world do we find you in?
So lovely to be here, and thank you to the audience members for joining, and also really lovely to be here with you, David and Paul. I'm in Geneva, where it is, I would classify it as sunny. After a bout of colder weather, it's warming up a bit here. So, and it is a very reasonable time of day. So thank you to the Australia-based colleagues for being with us right now.
Thanks so much, Irene. Great to have you on the line. And Paul, how are you doing, and where do we find you?
Yeah, hi, David. Thanks for having me. Hi, Irene, too, and hi to everyone out there in the audience. I hope it's a more reasonable hour wherever you are. So like David, I'm in Australia. It's quarter to midnight now, so a little balmy here, but still quite pleasant at the tail end of summer. So great to be with you this evening.
Thanks, Paul. And for full disclosure, if you're wondering where Paul is, he's actually been kicked out of the house for tonight. We won't talk too much about this on the panel, but feel free to reach out to him, for some support and guidance. Thanks so much, Paul, for joining us and making this late hour. Great to have you on board. Look, we really want to start tonight's discussion by defining the problem as we see it. And, as we frame this session, we really spoke about how climate change will increasingly affect the most vulnerable communities in South Asia. And in fact, we know it already is. We see extreme weather events, limited natural resources, the salinisation of key water sources. We see struggling crops, we see livestock struggling, and the undermining of livelihoods and food securities. And these impacts, they're really projected to become increasingly significant drivers of acute humanitarian needs and disaster-related displacement in the coming years. Irene, we'd love to start with you tonight as we sort of address these issues. Coming from, the UNHCR as a large multilateral agency of the UN, can you really give us a big picture perspective of the trends and challenges that you're seeing around the world as a result of climate change?
Absolutely. And the situation, if anything, I think is more dire than what we've all seen and heard on the news. It's really about two crises that are coming together, not in an additive way, but unfortunately in a multiplicative way. So the first crisis is what we as UNHCR, the UN's refugee agency, have always been set up to serve, which are displaced people around the world. And unfortunately, we have the highest number of displaced people in the world that's ever been recorded. So there's today about 80 million people around the world who have been displaced from their homes. The second crisis is the climate crisis. And given this audience, I don't need to say more about that. It is the impact of carbon emissions, the impact of global warming, the impact of extreme weather events. Now, the reason I say that these crises are multiplicative and not additive is you do not get just if we treat each of these crises separately, they're not addressable on their own. And under the status quo scenario of where the world is heading in terms of warming, but also the lack of, in too many places, lasting solutions for human displacement. So under this status quo scenario, by 2050, 200 million people will be needing humanitarian assistance. So in that sense, it really is multiplicative. Things are escalating for the worse, and urgent action is needed now. Now, in South Asia, I think one place where all of that really comes to life for us as an agency is in southern Bangladesh. Bangladesh is one of the biggest hosts of refugees in the world. They host about 1 million Rohingya refugees in a region of southern Bangladesh that's amongst the most climate vulnerable regions, geographies out of anywhere in the world. And you see this in the daily lives of refugees, how the refugees there, so first and foremost, they get distributed dry food. They have to cook that food for it to be edible and not starve. And in the beginning stages of the latest emergency that happened in 2017, 2018, the forest had to be cut down for people to eat. And that caused all kinds of animal panic. There were elephants that were panicked and stampeding through villages where people lived. There was risks of mudslides and landslides, instability, lack of safety. And for women and children who have to go further and further away, women and girls in particular, to collect firewood, this is a safety hazard. And it is shocking the proportion of women and girls who have been harassed globally in refugee settings on their way to collect firewood, which is a daily task. So really, it's a set of issues around protection, around human outcomes, around health outcomes that are all the intertwined result of forced displacement and climate change, which we urgently need to address. Back over to you, David.
Thanks, Irene. Look, I think that's a really useful insight that you've given us there, and really kind of sets that big picture perspective. I mean, think of those numbers you spoke about, 250 million people. It's just staggering, and we can only imagine the sort of response that's needed to tackle that. Paul, if we could break that down to the community level. I mean, obviously Save the Children works in communities around the world. Can you tell us, narrow that down for us? What does that look like in the communities that Save the Children's working in? Again, what are the sorts of trends and challenges that you're seeing?
Yeah, thanks, David. And just to echo everything Irene has said, I think what we find the greatest challenge of climate change is that it not only brings a whole swath of new challenges to people and communities everywhere, but it exacerbates all of those existing ones as well, and really creates these kind of balance tipping points and kind of the mounting crises that we see. I guess, David, as you said at the start, there's no doubt that the climate is changing, and we see it all around us. But so many of us that sit in much more privileged positions, as we do, and as many of the people in the audience today do, we often forget the immediacy of it. We see it as a challenge for the distant future, and shifting that perspective, I think, is really difficult. And it is happening, as we see things like these intense storms, for example, happening in the southern US right now, with people living in dire conditions for days and days without electricity, which is something that they have always taken for granted, in a freezing cold winter. Or last year, fires, catastrophic bushfires right around my house. So, even in privileged parts of the world, we're starting to gain an appreciation for the kinds of impacts that other people are experiencing on a daily basis. We're seeing, David, as you said, more and more extremes, floods, storms, droughts, fires, etc. We're seeing slower changes, like changes in species ranges, that result in things like pandemics occurring more and more often, localized epidemics. And I think really critically, what we see on the ground most often is a real exacerbation of existing inequalities, along with the advent of new ones. I think the key challenges that we see are almost prosaic. They're everyday things. They're things that have always happened largely, but there's more and more and worse. So, anywhere where it has always been hot at certain times of year, we're seeing those extreme heat events increasing, and people not having access to places where they can cool down, so increasing infant and childhood mortality or affecting older people. Places where there have always been strong storms that, may have been buffered by mangroves or coastal grasses previously, where those have been deforested because of economic constraints. We're now seeing an intensification of those storm events, increasing numbers of those strong storms, which further buffet, and then exacerbate those economic challenges that are already been existing, resulting in people moving and then exacerbating the challenges that people like Irene face on a day-to-day basis in managing. So I think the key message for me that we're seeing on the ground is, where things were bad, they're getting worse, and where things were not so bad, they're starting to sort of disintegrate, and it's tougher and tougher to hold together. But I think one of the other things, strength and resilience in many communities, that the depths of which we hadn't really plumbed previously. When you see these kind of rolling crises on top of each other, and people kind of bounding together and finding a way through, it's really quite incredible. I think we're also finding now that the world is finally starting to wake up to the fact that this is a crisis, and it's a crisis now, and we have absolutely missed the window to avoid the crisis. And there's an increasing recognition that we really, really need to do something about this yesterday, and if not yesterday, then today, and if not today, then we're really in trouble.
Thanks, Paul. Look, I think both yourself and Irene there have certainly defined the problem, the issue for us. And maybe if we move away from the doomsday scenario, I want to talk about that sense of waking up and how organisations, and governments around the world are responding. I would love to hear from both of you as to the solutions that your respective organisations are really presenting to tackle these challenges in different ways. Irene, perhaps we can, commence with you and some of the work that you're spearheading at UNHCR.
Absolutely. And we also do this work with many partners, including yours, including Save the Children, other NGOs, and importantly, governments, and many local communities around the world. So it's certainly not our battle alone, it's our battle together. And that's what makes me optimistic that we can tap into the collective resilience and find solutions. Really, I think the work that we're commencing now is scaling up all of those grassroots community-led solutions, and also many of which that come from other sectors. So private sector-led solutions, for example, the dramatic cost reduction and increase in affordability of solar systems over the last 2 decades, now makes that the not just the clean solution, but also increasingly in many places around the world, the most affordable solution compared to fossil fuels. And so that is tremendous. And I think what we're working on at UNHCR is really taking all of these bright spots that we and you and others have trialed in many places over the past however many years, and saying, okay, now we've got to put our foot on the clean electric car gas pedal. So
Thank you for clarifying that. We're glad you did that. Good.
Yes. And really scale it all the way up to 100% of all the places that that need those solutions, and to back it with a different business and operational model that supports that rapid scale up. And so I'll give you an example because it could sound fairly conceptual. One of the major pieces of infrastructure that UNHCR and other partners support for refugee and host communities around the world are a network of water boreholes. These are absolutely critical, as you can imagine, because refugee crises involve a bunch of people moving into a place that often suffers from an infrastructure deficit in the first place. So these are typically poorer, more infrastructure poor parts of developing countries, and developing countries are 90%, host 90% of the refugees around the world. And so one of the first things that has to happen is that a borehole needs to be drilled so that people can have water. And traditionally, that's been powered by diesel because of the widespread, everybody knows how to run a diesel generator and pump, essentially. Now, over the last 10 years or so, we've seen, and our partners have seen, hey, we could use a solar pump instead. That technology, it has been developed, it's been trialed, we understand it. And our traditional model then has been to write a bunch of grants, ask donors, please, can we have the capital investment to pay for these solar pumps, which require more money up front, but then in the next few years you save money, right? And so we, beg, we plead, we write these beautiful grant proposals. Now that's solarized a small proportion of our global footprint of water pumps that we run. We have several thousand pumps, but we need to go much faster. And so recently, what we've been doing internally is to say, okay, let's actually look at the business case for solarizing the total footprint of water pumps. And instead of looking at it in this one-time cost comparison, in which the capital expenditure of solarization is always going to be higher than paying for diesel for 1 year, 2 year, or even 3 years in most cases, let's look at the total lifetime value. And let's take a long enough frame to really understand and adjust our systems to be able to take advantage of the fact that if we look at it on a 5+ year time frame, solar systems are actually cheaper than diesel. And not only that, of course, much better for the environment. And then we can develop a replenishment fund mechanism that revolves the savings back into being able to allow us to invest in solarizing the next borehole and the next borehole and the next borehole. And so it's financially sustainable as well as environmentally sustainable. So that's just one example of how we're fitting a new global and operational model to support a much more holistic scale up of clean energy solutions.
Perfect. Thanks, Irina. You know, I think it's great for us to hear stories like that, especially that innovative financing model for those of us in NGO land. You know, we appreciate that sense of writing proposals and always looking how do we connect with, you know, the most appropriate donors. But, you know, clearly you're looking for a way to change things up, and that's a really strong example there. Similarly, Paul, tell us about what Save the Children is doing. You know, traditionally we think of Save the Children as you know, a traditional child-focused NGO. What approaches are you utilizing there to do things differently?
Yeah, thanks, David. And I guess coming at this from a slightly different angle to Irene and looking more at the kind of adaptive capacity, you know, rather than the reducing emissions. But of course, you know, solar pumps also build adaptive capacity, so there's a win-win there for sure. I mean, so David, as you said, you know, we're quite a venerable institution of an NGO, been around for quite a long time, doing really similar stuff for that whole time. You know, we already work in many of the places that are hardest hit by the climate crisis. You know, we're in communities working with them to address key challenges from staying healthy and safe, getting access to a quality education, bouncing back after a disaster. But what we're finding is, you know, as everybody is, that has these development gains that we've been working towards for years and years and years in many places become harder to achieve and become harder to sustain in the face of escalating crises. We need to think differently about how we go about this work going forward. And that doesn't necessarily mean doing things specifically differently. It doesn't necessarily mean working in different sectors per se, because we know that this crisis touches all sectors and it touches all people everywhere. So two things I think that we're doing at the moment. One, I wouldn't call innovative, but I think it's worth mentioning because it's really, it should be the new normal, and it's kind of a no-brainer when you think about it, but it's not always happening. And the other, which I think is kind of a little more on the bleeding edge. So the first one is that, you know, we're starting to think about climate change in everything that we do. So we're mainstreaming climate risk and resilience building across those education programs, across those health programs, across those food security and livelihoods programs, thinking not just about the disasters that may happen now, but also the future context in which the children and families and communities that we're working with will exist. We know that, you know, in 10 years, we'll be living in a very different world. In 20 years, we'll be living in a completely different world. And we need to think forward and think about the way that we're working with communities now, and the kinds of lives and livelihoods that will be available to them in that climate change future. And if we're not thinking about that, then we may be setting people up to fail, which is obviously the opposite of our intention. So that's kind of point one. And then point two is that we're looking to take our child-centered approach to community-based and locally led adaptation action really to scale. So looking at how we can bridge that gap between this growing amounts of global climate finance that are flowing around. It's a drop in the ocean compared to what is needed, but it is increasing and increasing rapidly, and much more rapidly than traditional development assistance, you know, as we see fiscal crises and economic issues around the world putting the brakes on aid programs in many places. Donor countries do seem to be living up as far as possible to their climate finance commitments, even where they're kind of breaking their commitments on broader development aid. But there's a real gap. There's a bottleneck between that global finance and the communities that really need access to it. And so, you know, we see that much of that finance, almost all of it, is still very much focused on reducing emissions or avoiding emissions in high emitting places, and almost none, about 20% of public climate finance is directed towards adaptation, and a much smaller percentage of private climate finance is directed towards adaptation. But even within that, almost none of it is specifically directed towards community-based adaptation. Most of it goes to the national level for larger scale projects around strengthening infrastructure or developing plans and policies. And these are all incredibly useful and important things to do. But really what we're missing is what happens at that local level where those impacts are explicitly felt. So Save the Children was recently accredited to the Green Climate Fund, which is the world's largest dedicated climate source of global climate finance. And we really see this as an innovative spot. There's the late night coming in, where we can kind of really help to create that bridge between the money up here and the people down here, and really start to think about how we can catalyze a change in those structures and really break that bottleneck and push that funding right through to build adaptive capacity and resilience in communities, the world over.
Thanks, Paul. It's really interesting to hear both of you talk about that idea of scale, looking for solutions that are scalable, but also have, sustainable financing mechanisms to them. And that's kind of two, very different examples, but yet sort of showing how using different approaches there. I guess the question, the resulting question to both of you then is around, these solutions that you've identified, what is it about them that you feel will make them game changers, really driving that transformative, scalable impact that we're all looking for? Maybe Paul, we'll kick off with you.
Yeah, so look, I think we're at a really interesting time. So, I just mentioned bemoaned the fact that that while we're seeing climate finance growing, it's really not growing particularly speedily enough in general, and certainly not for adaptation, and certainly not for community-based adaptation. But we are seeing an incredible upsurge in interest in the idea of adaptation. For a long time, it was very much in the too hard basket, or it was just kind of development anyway. So why would you need special finance for that? But we're really seeing an upsurge in interest. And I think really we're at the point that we can capitalize on that as a community, to start thinking about how we can pull some of that growing portion of funding and really push it down to that community level. One of the key issues with community-based or locally led adaptation is that it has been perennially in pilot phase. We've been doing, but not just us, I mean, lots of NGOs, lots of other organizations, UN agencies have been piloting these community-based approaches for decades now. And we know they work. We've got the evidence. We know that they change lives and they build resilience really effectively, and they're incredibly cost effective. But we keep begging for small amounts of money to do another 12-month pilot here or a 2-year pilot there. And that is great. But what we really need to do is just stand up and say, you know what, this stuff works, bring it on, we can handle it, let's push it out and really get it happening. And I think, in South Asia, I'm thinking about Nepal, and I'm thinking about Bangladesh. Bangladesh is the birthplace of community-based adaptation. We know it works. It's been working there for decades and decades and decades. Community-based approaches are embedded in national policy frameworks and flow all the way down from there to the local level. The system is there, it just needs finance. Nepal, the same thing. They took their UN National Adaptation Program of Action and they democratized it, and they took it to the local level, and they consulted in a highly participatory manner right down at the community level, and they have these amazing plans just waiting. Like at the end of the day, as much as I hate to say it, it's about the funding. The skills are there, the knowledge is there, the experience is there. It's all there. We just need to start pointing this barrel of financing, in that direction, and really start to make change.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful to understand. Irene, same question to you. Again, the solution you've described. Again, just articulate for us, why you feel it is a game changer, and again, within that context of of Bangladesh and the Nepals of the world.
Absolutely. I wish I had a barrel of finance. No, just kidding. So
I think we all wish we had that, right?
Exactly. I think for us, the reason why this flow fund model, which is this borehole solarization revolving fund model that I referred to, that we just started at UNHCR, is a game changer, is that it's not just another activity that we're promising to do. Instead, it's really that we have redesigned how we do the whole thing around water systems, how we design them, how we think about them, the time frame upon which we think about things, and the way that the money works. And it's that whole system around it that has changed that makes me optimistic that we can get to that 100% scale in terms of serving all the communities that need models like this. Because before, as Paul was referring to, it would be us applying for little grants here and there. It's adding activities. And no, this is not anymore about adding activities to the long list of other things. This is actually taking all the needs of communities and reorienting everything that we do so that it's a operational model, a business model, a mindset around serving communities in a way that lives up to their needs genuinely and lives up to our collective values, and makes it the MO that we just live and breathe at work every day. And we're really taking that, the borehole thing is one example, but we're really systematically looking at every area of need with that same set of questions. How do we make the operational model? How do we make the business model? How do we make the financing model all geared towards a clean, sustainable, resilience-oriented model that serves communities and reduces the environmental impacts?
Thanks so much, Irene. That really sort of explains it quite clearly for us and helps us sort of comprehend what's possible, what can be different there. Look, last question to the both of you before we wrap up the session. I'm mindful we're part of AVPN's conference, and so that means that on the call, we've got philanthropists and social investors, corporate partners, valued stakeholders like that. How can those who operate in that space engage and connect in the sort of activity that you've been talking about tonight? And maybe, Irene, if you could start for us there.
Well, first and foremost, thank you for your attention and for really learning about these sets of issues. If you want to learn more, you can go to UNHCR.org. We also always welcome donations. In terms of global refugee needs, our budget has never, ever in our history been enough to meet the needs of 80 million displaced people around the world. Again, that's the highest number that's ever been recorded in human history. And so, if you are in a lucky enough position to be able to give, please do give to us. And we do, our budget does end up in the hands of many worthy implementing partners, including Save the Children. And if you are a financier, if you understand financing models and are interested in them and are able to use modalities beyond donating, please get in touch. You can get in touch with me on my LinkedIn, and we'd be happy to have a discussion about how to work together and really utilize your organization's capabilities to do something in innovative financing for the support of displaced people. Thanks.
Thanks, Irene. And Paul, you've got less than 1 minute.
All right, so in 1 minute, look, three things, not knowing who's in the audience exactly. If you're a donor, make local adaptation the cornerstone of your strategy. And if you want to talk about opportunities to co-finance large-scale, locally led adaptation projects in South Asia and beyond, give me a call, hit me on LinkedIn, Twitter, wherever you need to. I'll stay up to midnight if I have to. If you're in government, anchor adaptation policies in local reality. Pick up these successful pilot models and embed them in national systems and scale them up. And if you're an investor, a financier, a philanthropist, then invest in the next generation. Support innovative approaches and climate smart skills development for the people who will drive the future innovation and help solve this crisis. And make no bones about it, it is a crisis.
Well, Irene and Paul, thanks so much for your time today. It's been incredibly insightful. I'm sure we could have kept talking for so much longer, but I think you've really painted a strong picture for the audience as to what's possible, how we can think differently. We'll call it an end there. Isha, back over to you.
Thank you so much, David. I think, thank you so much to all the speakers. It was a lovely discussion. We've now come to the end of the panel discussion. This session is made possible with the kind support of our festival partners, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, SESME Workshop India, the Rockefeller Foundation, COVID Action Collab, DNV Advisory Services LLP, British Asian Trust, WPP India CSR Foundation, Catalyst Management Services, UNDP, and Satwa. To continue chatting with your speakers and fellow delegates in this session, please make full use of the messaging and meeting function of our platform. Do share your highlights of this session on social media and remember to tag us using the hashtag AVPN South Asia 2021 and social impact. Up next, the session on momentum in the e-mobility sector in India, which will be starting at 6:45. Thank you so much, and please enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you.